Bonjour, Niigaanwewidam, Niigaanwewidam. My name is Niigaan Sinclair, and welcome to the first of many NCTR dialogues. These are dialogues that we're having with residential school survivors and also other allies that we have on this journey of reconciliation to discuss the TRC calls to action, where we've gone, where we've come from, where we're going, as well as discussions on reconciliation, the complex issues that face Canada, our communities, and also the complex relationships that we all have. Today we're joined by two amazing survivors and advocates for our communities who come to us from two different parts of Kanata, in fact, two different ends of it. And so from very far distances, we have from where I am in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, way off east of me, we have our Mi'kmaq grandmother, Dorene Bernard, who is an advocate, an educator, also a water walker. Bonjour, Dorene, how are you?
Good.
Do you want to tell everyone a little bit about what community you come from, what family, any family connections, and also anything about your territory?
Sure. So my name is Kesadam Dandali Ulnui, and I'm from the Otter clan, Gilnik clan, and from the territory of Sibaganagati in Mi'kmaq, here in on the Atlantic coast. The residential school here in Sibaganagati was less than 5 kilometers away from our community, and it was the only one on the Atlantic coast for all the provinces here. All the students that came from Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Gaspé region of Quebec. Yes, they all came to this one school that was here.
I happened to go to the Halifax regional gathering for the TRC, one of the national gatherings in Halifax. And yeah, the stories of the Shubenacadie school were brutal and absolutely terrible. And so maybe we'll talk a little bit about that today, as well as some of the really profound memories. But the territory out there is absolutely beautiful. Yeah. Having spent a time a little bit close to you there in New Brunswick, I've spent a number of time out there. Coming to us way from the west of me is Phyllis Webstad, who is Shuswap. She's also an advocate and educator as well. And she's most notably known for one of the founders of Orange Shirt Day. And you can look up some of the work that she's done online of how she's helped all of us and guided us to be able to understand what Orange Shirt Day is all about, honoring our survivors and also honoring the great journey that they've come. Bonjour, Phyllis, how are you?
Good. Good morning. It's morning here in BC.
Phyllis, do you want to tell us a little bit about your territory, where you come from?
Yes, my name is Phyllis Webstad. I'm from the Strachan First Nation, which is Kennel Creek, Dog Creek. We are a part of the Shawetm, or the Shuswap Nation. There's 17 bands in our nation in BC, and to give a geographical perspective, I'm about 7 hours north of Vancouver. The residential school that I attended was called St. Joseph Indian Residential School, or we just called it simply the Mission. There were 4 nations and perhaps more that attended St. Joseph. There was the Shawetm, or the Shuswap, the Chilcotin, or the Chilcotin, Deketh, the Southern Carrier, and also the Lillooet and the Stetlam people were brought in by train. That's the Mount Currie, Lillooet area, Pemberton, Whistler area came to our residential school. I have 1 son and 5 grandchildren, been blessed with 5 grandchildren in age from 16 to 4 months old. So it's, I sure miss them during this pandemic, and I look forward to being able to go see them, and I get choked up just talking about not seeing them. So
it is a remarkable time that we're in. As we're taping this right now, the world is going through COVID-19 pandemic, and I wish that we could all be together for this interview, but we're doing the best that we can to be able to bring the knowledge of our survivors and also of our many advocates in our communities to those who are working out there. Of course, for many young people, school is still continuing. And so these discussions and these topics are very important to be able to deal with. Now, what this series is about is for us to reflect a little bit on the TRC, to reflect a little bit on the journey that we've come, and then also the complex issues of reconciliation that the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is invested in their everyday work. So what we're doing today is we're going to look at some of the calls to action and kind of about, we often hear from the kind of what we call the big picture advocates, and those are people like my father, Senator Murray Sinclair, who is, of course, heavily involved with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then also political leaders. We hear a lot from political leaders. We hear a lot from chiefs, but we don't often hear from survivors specifically on what the vision of these calls to action mean to them. And what we're going to do today is we're asking both of you, who are both renowned educators, people who work in schools, work with children, have also had experiences, good, bad, and great and ugly involving your history with schooling as well. And that may come into some of your conversations. And so we're going to look at calls to action 6 through 12 today, which are on about education. And specifically these calls to action talk about the legacy of residential schools and how they impact education, how schooling has been formed from dysfunctional relationships with Indigenous peoples, and how Canadian schools have shaped perceptions of teachers, of principals, and also of students today, involving not just non-Indigenous peoples, but also our own communities as well. So I'm going to ask you a specific question or questions related to a call to action. And maybe you can explain a little bit to those out there, what does it mean to you to have the calls to, what does it relate to? What does it look like? So the first question that I want to ask you is basically, why is education important to children? And why is language and culture important, specifically for Indigenous children, but maybe also non-Indigenous children as well? And then also, if you could talk a little bit about the roles of community in education, that would be great as well.
Well, we have to look at some of the things that we missed out on as children. And of course, my grandmother and my mother and dad were also survivors, as I was. So there's like 2 generations in our family who attended the residential school. And although my dad could speak his language, he spent 11 years in there from 1929 to 1940. And so he lost the value of the language. He didn't lose his language because I only heard him speak the language when he was 68 years old, and a few weeks before he passed away. He was sick in the hospital. And I asked his family to come to let them know that he was very sick and they wanted to see him. This would be the time to come. When they came in to see him, they were speaking Mi'kmaq fluently. And I just said, "Oh, Dad, don't speak Mi'kmaq," because I have never heard him speak in my life. And when he started speaking back fluently, talking to his sister and his nephews, and he was speaking, they were communicating. I had to leave the room and go outside the room and cry, just because I realized that he didn't lose his language, but what he lost was the value of teaching his language to us. My grandmother, she could still speak her language. She spoke both English and she tried to teach us. When we went there for summers and stayed with our grand, remember she used to try to teach us, and at that time I don't know, I didn't feel like I have a lot of regrets of not sitting with her more and learning from her what she tried to teach. My grandmother also had problems with alcohol throughout our life, so I think that was part of it, when she wanted to teach something, and in contrast to other times when there was turmoil, I would be leaving, more or less. So not only the language, but also our cultural teachings, about our connection to the land and the water, and taking care of the land and the water, and learning how to pick medicines and all these things. She taught us some things. We went out pick medicine when we were sick. It wasn't something that we did all the time. When I was sick or when somebody was sick, she would take me out in the back into the woods and show me the medicines that we needed just for that time. And I wouldn't know how to put them together. But later on in life, of course, I studied herbalism and I learned from the elders. I had to go to different elders in my adulthood to ask them to teach me, about the medicines and the things that we needed for healing. So a lot of the ceremonies, a lot of the things that most people take for granted, like my grandkids today, they know about ceremony. They know about their connection to the land and the water. They walk with me on the water walks. They have a lot of these things, teachings, I think, that we didn't grow up with. And I was well into my, late 30s when I started to learn the things that we take for granted that our little grandkids are learning today. So I think our education starts as a child, as a small child. And I think that's what has been impacted the most through residential schools and through the legacy, that we carry forward. And I think that's what we want when we say education. That's what we mean. We mean about having the space, sacred space, and the space to revive these cultural teachings about who we are, our language. Everything in our teachings is in our language. So I think we need to focus and demand from the government that our languages are paramount to our education. And that's not happening. That's not happening in community. If the kids get an hour class in school on a reservation with their language or their culture, it's not enough. It's not enough to revive a language that's near extinction. We know in our community, in Sibaganagati, which was like I said, less than 5 kilometers away from the residential school, we have a handful of fluent speakers, elders that can speak fluently. And I can count them on my hand here in a community of 2,500. So I know that we need to focus on the resources and the funding needed to put in language courses for not only the children, but the parents, the adults as well, and grandparents. That's where we are today.
So, language, what you're saying, and culture, specifically ceremonies and other things, are specifically relationship building mechanisms to be able to bring people together, also connect with the territory, with their land themselves, with their history, with the future. And that is why they're important to education. And specifically what we're referring to is call to action 10, which is one of the biggest calls to action, which says curriculum is important, language is important, involving parents and community is important, because school is supposed to bring people together, not tear people apart. Now, Phyllis, you of course are one of the founders of Orange Shirt Day, which is probably the most important relationship building day in the entire school year today. Can you tell us a little bit about why is it important to have language and culture involved in schooling today, and to reverse some of the things of the past, but then also look towards the future?
When I was looking at the questions last night, I could think of stories to tell to answer the questions. And so I'm glad, Dorene, that you answered in stories, because that's how I usually think, is how does this pertain to me, and how does this affect my family, or what can I tell as a part of my history or my family's history to explain or to answer. What I thought about was the first part of the question is why education is important to Indigenous children and why language and culture is important. Myself, my son, and my grandchildren do not live on the reserve. From where I live, it's about an hour and a half away, close to 2 hours to get down to the Fraser River. And for my grandchildren, it's about maybe 3.5, 4 hours to get back to the reserve. So we do not live on the reserve. I grew up on the reserve with my grandmother, and I have memories of as a child spending summers on the Fraser River fishing. And my grandchildren, I realized, didn't have that memory. And one of my other cousins, she was a new grandmother, and we were talking about that, because she also grew up partially with Granny, and how we wanted our grandchildren to have those same memories. So in, I believe it was 2012, we decided to start having our family gatherings, our family fish camps on the Fraser River. And everybody, I still have family that lives on the reserve, so they will come down to the river, and all of our family from that live in the cities, Vancouver, Prince George, and it's open to family and friends. And we teach the children, and I'm learning too, how to cut fish. And we fish at nighttime on the Fraser River by dip net, and the children get to, including my grandchildren, get to participate in that. So that in it is a learning, learning for them. We don't talk a lot of the language. I'm the third generation that attended residential school. My grandmother for 10 years, all of her 10 children, including my mother, who also attended for 10 years. And the language has progressively reduced throughout the generations. And I was involved in the Speewies Culture and Language Society here in Williams Lake for 10 plus years. And I considered myself the sandwich generation, where my efforts were to link up elders and students. And one of the recent efforts of that society is learning from others and going down to Kalispell in Washington. What they've done, and what I have always thought needed to be done, is they have a 2-year program that's completely immersion, and it is a paid job where you are living, breathing, waking up, going to sleep in the language for 2 whole years. And they have gone from a handful to over 200 speakers, what I understand. So, and I have the ear and the tongue, I guess, for the language, growing up with my grandmother. And I believe if I were to be in a 2-year program, that I would become fluent very quickly. But I, as everybody does, have bills to pay. Hydro bill, you have a mortgage, everybody. And just doing it an hour here, an hour there is not going to do it. It needs to be complete immersion. In our whole Secwepemc nation, we have one immersion school, possibly another one being worked on, but complete immersion is what I feel. And the second half of the question was role of parents and the community. And when we have our fish camps, the aunties are down there, and my uncle came a couple of times, and he knows how to make a dip net with just going into the woods with a knife and coming out and being able to make a dip net. So he has a lot to teach. And thinking as my role as a parent with my son didn't see the inside of high school, and I was new in my healing journey. But I didn't grow up with my mother, so I was committed to being there for him no matter what. And he actually quit school in grade 6. It's kind of funny now, but it wasn't. Well, it's not funny at all. But he never saw the inside of a high school, and he graduated with an adult dogwood out of the Friendship Center alternate program in Kamloops. And with thanks to a teacher who took an interest in him, they offered a lunch, so he would get up, go to school, have lunch, and have 2 hours of schooling. And so he was able to graduate with an adult dogwood. And what a difference that made in his life, having that grade 12 BC adult dogwood. It opened up so many opportunities for him. Maybe I can talk a bit more about that later, but that's good for me for now.
So we know that language and culture specifically deal with issues of the past, of disjuncture, dysfunctional relationships, trauma, and that would make the easy argument to say that teaching language and culture is a direct corrective way of dealing with suicide, drug and alcohol abuse. It's also a way to build strength, strong families, build the strength of families, which leads me to Call to Action 12, which says that what is the role of schools in helping to support Indigenous families to grow stronger bonds? Like, how important is the role of schools to help develop and support families? Dorene?
I've had different experiences with schools. So from the residential school where families were torn apart, we were separated, and yeah, all those familial relationships were severed. And then going to school in Boston. So we moved to Boston, and I went to school there. And when I got out of the residential school, junior high, and there was a lot of racism in Boston at that time. And I even started high school when there was forced busing. They had forced busing and segregation. They were trying to bring the Black and the white communities together in the same schools where they were segregated. It was really hard for me because I didn't fit in. I wasn't Black and I wasn't white. And it was very hard for me to fit in. I was in the middle all the time. I was more, I guess, seen as a Hispanic, Cuban, I was more accepted by them than either one of the other races, and it was really hard for me. Even though they would just talk Spanish to me, and I would say, "I'm not Spanish, I'm Mi'kmaq." It was really hard. And I remember in high school in South Boston High, where the teacher would call on me. We're reading history, and he wanted me to get up and read this passage to say that Indigenous people were savages, and I wouldn't read it. I told him, "I'm not reading that." I ended up throwing the book down and walking out of his class because I was the only Mi'kmaq in that class at the time, and the only First Nations, I guess, in that class. And I just said, I didn't even feel like I knew enough about my own identity, but I knew I wasn't going to read something that made it derogatory to be First Nation. So I remember going to school when they had metal detectors outside the school for us to walk into the school because of people with weapons. Yeah, the police were in the schools then. And this was in the 70s, 72, 71, 72. So after quitting school, walking out of there and quitting, and then I came back to Canada, to Nova Scotia, to go to high school here. And I ran right into another racist school where it was, but you could tell what side it was on because it was Mi'kmaq and it was white people. And it was really hard growing up in that, I left Boston to come to school to get away from all this craziness so I could learn something and finish school. And I came home to go to school, and it was the same. It was worse. And it's still happening today. In 2020, we had children before the COVID lockdown where kids were getting expelled from school for fighting, for, those kind of things, and the racism that was happening down at the high school. We have a school here in our community from grades primary to grade 12, but yet some students still went out to Milford, to the neighboring town, to go to high school. And the problems are still there. So I know that a lot of the healing that we thought, the relationship building and the understanding and the reconciliation is not happening.
So schools should be models to help support families, but then also the broader community as a family, right?
Yeah.
Schools should be the model to teach people to be able to live together, to work together, and being taught, of course, like many of us, I went to school in the 1990s. I learned that our people were savages in, the 1990s. Those textbooks are still around.
Yeah.
They're still being used in 2015, 2020, the same textbooks that I used. So Phyllis, what is the role of schools to be able to encompass or model how people should act in their families or how they should build their families, and then also the broader community?
I always think of my own experience, and I just finished a cross-Canada tour going to schools, elementary and high schools across Canada. And what I found in the schools was that, and it was in relation to Orange Shirt Day. So what I did was go across Canada to schools and tell them my story of how I lost my orange shirt, the history of my family, and the impacts back then and up to today. And I found that every school across Canada they're all in different stages, I guess, and different understandings. And I found that in the schools where there were champions or someone, whether they be Indigenous or non-Indigenous, take on the responsibility of indigenizing that school, those were the schools that I enjoyed the most, and the kids were most respectful. And in order for parents to be going into schools, they need to feel comfortable and welcome. And the schools where I seen there were the residential school apology, there was Cheney Wenjack information on the boards, there was Orange Shirt Day, there was Indigenous art. Those were the schools where parents showed up, I found, for my presentations. And the things that I witnessed being taught in schools across Canada due to Orange Shirt Day is the truth and the history of what happened to us in residential schools. And I found that the children are learning about what happened and they have empathy. And when I have an opportunity to talk to other survivors, I tell them what I'm experiencing with these children. And the seed of reconciliation is being planted in these schools across Canada. These children will grow up being our next doctors and lawyers and bank tellers and managers. And they will grow up knowing our history and what happened to us. Orange Shirt Society is releasing a book mid-August. It's called Orange Shirt Day. And we found that we needed to do this to let Canada know about how Orange Shirt Day started and why it's there, and to have conversation every year on September 30th about residential schools across Canada. Because my story is every survivor's story. I didn't just wake up one day and decide September 30th was Orange Shirt Day. There's a whole bunch of people that made the day possible. And my story is every survivor across Canada lost something, a piece of clothing when they went to school, and they all have a story. It's a platform for them to tell their story. And another thing that children, I noticed that they were being taught was their territory that they lived in. I would often ask the students if they knew what territory they were in and the history behind that territory. So that's very important.
It is completely true that when a school accurately reflects the community and what healthy relationships should exist in that community, the kids in that school, the young people, not only have better home lives, the parents begin to be influenced by the school, but also the society at large begins to have productive relationships. And as you pointed out, in workplaces. Call to Action 7 talks specifically about employment. What should we be teaching young people about in school that will help them to be better workers into the future? And specifically, I'm thinking about Indigenous young people. That's what Call to Action 7 says. We should reduce the gap between education and employment. And what is stopping young people from succeeding in workplaces or even finishing school? We'll start off with Dorene.
There's been some programs that they've had here because of the problems they had in school with the youth, where they had like alternative program where they can't go to the regular school, but they could go to an alternative program with the adult learners almost, and have the same kinds of curriculum, but also life skills to help them to handle whatever life throws at them, really, because they have, there's a lot of social problems, of course, growing up. They need more life skills, how to, to deal with the pressures of the youth, the pressures, the peer pressure, the drugs, their introduction to to drugs, alcohol, those kinds of things. But also, I think, is to work on their self-identity, to work on who they are, and to learn to love themselves. I remember doing a 7 sacred teachings with a at-risk youth group that was in an alternative education. And when I went in and sat down with them, when we were going to go through, I only had the one day to do this 7 sacred teaching workshop. We got to 2 of the teachings, and then I was done. I couldn't go back and do the rest of them. But it took half a day just to go through what love is, because for the most part, out of the 12 youth, 8 of them said, "I don't know." They don't know. I asked them, what does love is mean to you? What is love? And they said, "I don't know. I don't know." You know, after the 8th one, I really believed they didn't know. And the others, of course, they said sex, or, you know, it was like, okay. So we spent the morning, 3 hours on love, what love is, love for Creator, love for yourself, self-love, and how you could love someone else, love for Mother Earth, you know, all these different ways of seeing what love is. And then they got it, you know, they said it and they felt it. Then we went on to respect, and it took the other half a day to talk about what respect is, because they didn't feel respected either. So we're talking about basic life skills, basic things that we take for granted as parents now and as grandparents. So I have 9 grandchildren, and, you know, I could ask any one of them what that means, and they could tell me. But I didn't even know what it meant myself until like I said, until I was much older as an adult. Now we have children, young people that are trying to find their way through the education system, but also what they want to do with their life to as a career, or even looking at what kind of job they want to do. I've heard people say they want to do something they love, not just for the money, but because they want to love what they're doing. And if they can't do that, then they don't want to do it. So creating the work that they can do for a long time, and that they're going to love to do it. I think they need those skills and those teachings, those basic, you know, teachings of how to be a good human being. So we're not doing that, and I think that that is really important for them to move on to the place where they could say, these things are going to help me to do work, good for creation. They say good work that's good for creation, that's helpful.
So the call to action specifically says that, you know, governments should be reducing the funding gap. For example, First Nation schools funded 2/3 to every other Canadian school, for example. But I think the important thing to identify here is that what you're talking about is what's often the education employment gap, is that if you don't have traditional education or a sense of identity or a way to deal with the trauma of the past coming from residential school, if you don't love yourself, then you can't love a career. It's almost like when you finish and you enter into the employment force, you're not going to know what love is or how to love the work that you do if you don't love yourself.
I think we're looking at the foundations, you know, the cultural foundations.
And that will be the ultimate closing of the gap, which is more than just money. And money is important, don't get me wrong, but it's a crucial thing that elders were talking about when they're talking about education and employment gaps. They're also talking about mental health, well-being, the ability to know who you are and then know where you're going. Phyllis, what do you think?
I just had one more thing.
Oh, sure, go ahead, Doreen. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'll lose it if I don't.
No problem.
I've taught in some classes, in university classes, and to talk about the residential school, the legacy of the residential school, is like first year nursing students, different second, third year students. You know, they didn't even have the basic idea of what even residential schools were. They didn't have very much education at all on Indigenous people at all. And I think there's a grade 10 Mi'kmaq Studies course that wasn't even mandatory that you had to take it. It was like an elective. So if you took that, you get credit for that, and it's half, you know, whatever course in grade 10. And that's the extent of it. But I don't think it teaches, I mean, these are things that we didn't have in school. And my son is 46, and he didn't have this in school either. And my other son is 32, you know, and he had some of this, he was one of the ones that were in the alternate program because he couldn't deal with the racism and all the other structures in the school. No, my other son is 22. No, he's 23. He went to school here, and he knew who he was, and he went to high school on a reserve here, and he had more of an idea of his identity. And of course, he would be one to question anything that he didn't think was right. Nowadays, we're going into universities where they get a 45-minute class, one term, 45-minute class, and I'm supposed to go in there and teach them in 45 minutes about the legacy of the residential school and about the history of the Mi'kmaq and our treaty rights and all the things that are impacting us in that 45-minute class. It's very difficult, and that's all they're going to get. And then those students are going to be nursing students in Indigenous communities up north. Their first placements are going to be in Indigenous communities, and that's all they're going to have to understand what the culture and communities that they're going into. So I think that that's one place where this reconciliation is not reaching far enough. But we also have, on the other side of that coin, is our own people being able to bring in their history, their culture, and who they are, and what we contribute to society. And I think that's where the education is missing.
What kind of education should young people be getting to be able to help them become better in the workforce or more capable in the workforce, but also what keeps them from that success?
I was the education manager for my band for a few years. And one of my favorite posters that I had in my office was more education equals more opportunities. And I really, really believe in that. And one of the funding requirements, and I'm not sure if it's changed since then, was that post-secondary, in order to be funded, needed to be an accredited course, and trades were not accredited. But they are just as important. And I'm hoping that's changed for our band. I'll have to make a mental note to ask about that. But last night when I was thinking about these questions and talking to my cousin to help me to process what I needed to talk about today, one of them was that we need to, or students, in order for them to be successful and to succeed, they need to be able to see and to meet successful people, the ones that have been educated or that are spiritual leaders, or to be around people and to learn from them, and to have role models and to have those role models in their lives.
Isn't it amazing that we still are in a generation of firsts? And I think what Phyllis has identified is, for my dad, he was the first lawyer. My sister was the first travel agent. My other sister is the first computer programmer. I'm the first high school teacher and then later professor. We are still in a generation of firsts, and to be able to equip our young people, we're not really almost talking about content. We're talking about the ability to see success and then know that they too can achieve that success, and way far more so. My father often says that his children know more about the Indian Act than he knew as a lawyer out there practicing, because he had never been taught that. And so our young people are now being equipped with more knowledge, but it's not the knowledge so much that it will be the feeling of well-being and the ability to see success. Seeing my father successful, seeing my father stand up in court and advocate for our people was probably more impactful on me than anything else. Seeing my father, give up drinking, seeing my father choose to go to the lodge, seeing my father and my mother commit themselves to a healthy relationship with their children. You know, those things created impactful, huge things, and in many ways, healthy relationships with my teachers as well. But, you know, Call to Action 8 and 9 talks about the importance of Indigenous young people being taught at home. And being, you know, in schools that are adequately serviced, adequately funded. When I'm talking about at home, I'm talking about on reserve schools, because one of the things the residential schools, of course, did was force our young people away from communities. We still see that in most, you know, many First Nations in Manitoba, people being sent away for high school, elementary, and then being sent away for high school. What is the importance of Indigenous young people being taught in their communities? We'll start with Dorene.
Well, like I said, there's a double-edged sword on that. I would think seeing how, remember I talked about the racism in the schools? When we built our own school in the community, it kind of took care of that overt racism, but it also took away, I think, the children's social development, where they could go out into the other communities and to interact with, you know, with everyone. And I think giving them the opportunity to play sports with, you know, with diverse, on diverse teams, and to participate in some of the social and cultural things from the society all around us. And I think that takes away a little bit about for their development as well. But it also strengthens their ability to build their self-identity and their culture and their language and some of the things that we need here in our community. And community, I think, lifting up our community in a lot of ways. I remember one time we had hockey teams that were all Indigenous. Every player was Indigenous and we played against other, you know, communities one time. Now their children there's not enough players for that division, for that age group, so they have to go outside the community to join teams. So that opportunity to still do some of the things that we do for ourselves, for development, you know, for social development.
You immediately had me thinking about students who come to university for the first time, and many of them have experienced life just on reserve.
Yeah, well, that's what I was just going to get to that. Well, we hear a lot about the trauma and the problems of students coming from outside their community and their reserves and going into big cities. And of course, you know, they're at risk to die. They're at risk to be victimized as youth outside their community when they come into to the big cities. Not only because of their inability to fit in or to feel like they fit in, or the ways that they had their family and support all around them for all up until that time they leave their community, when they're most at risk as youth, that they come down to the city and they don't have that support system anymore. And then they're often singled out, you know, by people who would take advantage of that.
I think too, you know, if schools were adequately supported by treaty rights or you know, the adequate funding model for First Nations schools, they would get that experience. They would get experience off reserve. They would get experiences in, for instance, I'm thinking about students from Saging or from Manicotagan who come every year and spend, you know, about 3-4 days at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, having experience, because they really focus on an off-reserve life that they know many of these students will have. So it's important to not allow that culture shock but it's because they've committed to that work in a community, to say that not only must education involve the community, but it also must involve relationships off the community as well, because that will make the community stronger. Yeah. Phyllis, why is it important for students to get experiences of education within the community? And maybe you might want to speak a little bit about not just within a building, a school per se, but also with, let's say, elders or on the land in that community.
My grandchildren live off the reserve. When I was education manager, my son did live on the reserve. So my oldest grandson, when he was in kindergarten, went to the school. It was a school district school, but it was about a couple of minutes from the reserve. So they did get to live in the community, and it wasn't a band school, but they were being taught the language. And I remember he came and told me the one night the word for dog is a big horse or dog is a horse. And he was telling me the difference between the two, how you say the two. And that's always stuck with me. And I think about what they are missing, not being at the school and living at home, that connection to community, to learning about the land, going and doing things with their cousins and knowing who their cousins are, and having leadership support readily right there in the community, where they can be visual in the school and see the leaders in the community. And that's what I thought about with this question. And you were talking about first, when I do my presentations, I tell how for the first time in 4 generations, my grandchildren are living under the same roof as their mother and their father. I just realized this in 2018. Granny didn't have that, Mom didn't have that, I didn't have that, and my son didn't have that. So I remind Canadians of that the family system was broken, and it's starting, and I think of my grandchildren starting to be healed, and my son and his wife have made a commitment to their family and their children. And that is going to make a huge impact on the future generations, not only in my family, but I'm sure it's happening all across Canada.
That's pretty remarkable that that is a first, eh? And it's pretty remarkable that freedom in many ways is a first, to be able to have access to your family on your own terms, which is probably the most important expression of sovereignty, to be able to build your own family the way that your family was intended to be built, which our ceremonies talk about that is the most important aspect of family, is when our time together. And then Niigaanwewidam omaayayin in Anishinaabe, that's what we say. We begin where we are. Mm-hmm. And then that's where we go. We're not forced to go in a certain direction. It's because our family, that's sovereignty, right? We choose to go mm-hmm. in our direction. Now, this question is a bit sensitive, and so I know you both are prepared for this, but it is a very difficult topic to speak about, I think, because it involves call to action 6, which is one of the more controversial calls to action out of the 94 that the TRC called for. And that was to repeal Section 43 of the Criminal Code, which says that teachers can use corporal punishment on students for the purposes of education. And when I say corporal punishment, what I'm really talking about is physical punishment, but I might also refer to mental punishment as well. However, it's more easily definable as physical. Why should teachers not physically strike students, physically harm students? And then we might also speak about some mental abuse as well, because both of you, as being part of the residential school period, undoubtedly experienced or witnessed or had seen or heard of those survivors. I'm thinking particularly of the both of your experiences in the schools in which you attended and the stories that I know about. Why is it important for violence to not enter into schools?
Well, we know as one of the main traumas of the residential school was the abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental abuse. These are the things that that destroyed families. The impacts from the generations of the abuse in residential school came from the priests, the nuns, the brothers, the people who worked in the schools that were in positions of authority. So we know that, and of course, we've heard many stories of how that impacted individuals. We didn't hear much of the stories from the survivors' children, from the intergenerational impacts. And I think that's where we are seeing today in our communities still dysfunction in our families, and the far-reaching effects of 50 years since the residential school closed down, and we still have impacts in our communities and in our families. So that goes without saying, really, to explain, what kinds of abuse, and I think it's all kinds. It's all of it. So we have what we're dealing with now is to repeal a section of the law that says that it's okay, that it's allowable, they're covered by the law to allow people in authority, teachers, and to and this law, it's written in the 1800s and it has never been changed. So I think we've progressed much more further along since in 2020, where we would say that no, this is not acceptable for any child to be hurt physically, mentally, emotionally, sexually, and it would be okay. It would by a position of authority, whether they be teachers or parents. It's just that law covers parents as well. I was looking at it today, and I was like, well, it's an outdated law that protects corporal punishment, or whatever the law would deem to be considered corporal punishment to correct the behavior. And I was like, well, we know there's laws. We know there's laws that under the Child Welfare Act that would protect a child from any of those same things. So why are we hanging on to a law that would allow that to happen for teachers or for anybody else? So I think we have laws that will cover those things, and I don't know why they're having such a hard time to repeal this law, to not have any kind of protection for abuse of a child in the school. This is a teacher or...
Even if they did, even if there was moves to repeal it, because there are some faith-based schools where certain aspects of discipline are used. What you're saying is important is that when violence happened in residential school, it wasn't just between the perpetrator of the violence and the victim of the violence. It also impacted those around, those who witnessed it, but then also the survivor who then learn some of those behaviors. And then perhaps I'm thinking of Basil Johnson, who told stories of how he experienced abuse, not just from the priest, but also from the older boys. Mm-hmm. And then also when he returned back to communities and he looked around and he saw his cousins who were abusing their families because they had learned those behaviors in the schools. And so it's important to remark that violence, when it begins in the school, begins a long-standing journey of violence that impacts thousands of people. And so that's what you're pointing out there, and why, it's not just specifically about schools, it's also talking about the impact of violence that then becomes like a splash in the water and you don't know where the wave's gonna go. Mm-hmm. Phyllis,
the other side of that is also about teaching parenting. Teaching parenting, like Indigenous parenting courses, with those 7 sacred teachings, talking about other ways of discipline, showing the child, I guess, and the person other ways of dealing with frustration and grief and loss and all the different things that that we handle on a daily basis. And I think those are the things that we need more of. We need more of those things, not just the things to say, don't do this, but also these are other ways of coping, and these are other ways of parenting and correcting behavior and in love and respect and all those. And I think that's what Indigenous parenting.
That's why, going back to the question.
Right back to life skills and all the things that we have been left without, for many several generations.
Going back to question 2, we said all the way, or at the very beginning of this journey, is how can schools help healthy parenting begin, or healthy communities, healthy families? Phyllis, why should violence never be in schools? And then how does that impact the world around us for those who have experienced that violence in schooling?
I think of my grandchildren being in school, and if they were dealt the level of violence, mentally, physically, sexually, like that would be devastating. And it would be like another generation of what were the intergenerational impacts right now that I know I am working so hard to talk about and to be a cycle breaker of those intergenerational impacts of the residential school. And I just could not imagine my grandchildren being strapped or having to kneel on the floor or having to no choice in any matter, and the long-lasting mental impacts of being told what to do and what to think and when to do it and how to do it and for how long, and being physically beaten if you didn't understand. It just starts getting me upset when I start thinking about violence. And I have many stories in my family of my aunts and my uncles being of the violence and the mistreatment in residential school. And our generation and other generations trying to break those cycles and to be a healthy role model for future generations. And when I was talking with my cousin last night, there's always, I know we have humor in the weirdest of times that helps us get through. And because my cousin and I were raised partially by our grandmother. And on the reserve, we used to roam for hours. And if we didn't come home when we were supposed to, often Granny would show up with a willow stick, and she wouldn't hit us, but she would hit the ground beside us, and we would jump and go running. And so thank goodness she didn't beat us with it or hit us with it, but it was a way for her to show that like we needed to be home and we needed to listen to what she said. And so it brought up that discussion anyway about that last night.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking back to my father, and my father, of course, experienced great amount of violence from his father, and who learned that behavior from residential school. And my father only spanked me ever once, and he broke down in tears so badly that I don't remember the spanking, but I do remember the tears. And you know, my father spent, I would say, most of his life modeling behavior to me that I was so scared to disappoint him that he would just give me a look, and that was worse, I think, than any spanking I could ever get. And in many ways, that profound respect that I have for him has been the biggest discipline for me at all. It's been that he's always required respect, and that's probably been the most powerful teaching. And I think about that, he also learned that from his father when his father was sober. And so, you know, those things are really impactful and important for our communities. And violence doesn't solve anything, creates incredibly more problems exponentially. And I appreciate, and I say miigwech to both of you for being so brave with that answer. We've now reached the end of our questions, but probably the most important question of all for this round of discussions for NCTR dialogues. And you know, it involves call to action 11, which is referring to the tremendous amount of students who want to go to post-secondary, but oftentimes are kept back because of funding. Maybe can you both just say a few words? Both of you have had, we'll call it unbalanced or different or complex experiences with education. But for many Indigenous communities, education is going to be the ways out of poverty, the ways out of cycles of abuse, the ways out of cycles of unhealthy behaviors. Why is post-secondary, college or university, why are these important places for our people to go to? We'll start with Dorene.
Well, I believe that a lot needs to be done in post-secondary education to promote reconciliation, to promote education on Indigenous people across Canada, because like I said, up until the apology, many people didn't even know that we were still here. It's really sad, but I worked at a lot of different jobs, and people didn't even know that there were Mi'kmaq here or there, you know, like do we still live in teepees? They would ask. They would ask crazy questions. And this was 20, 30 years ago. But I would say, today, I think post-secondary education is very important for people who want to move on into a specific field, and training. Like our friend here said, the training programs, trades and the trading programs that people want to go to, they're just as important. Not everyone's going to go on to further their education in post-secondary, but they may go into a field of training towards a career that they're interested in. Most young people don't even know what they want to do yet, but they want to try these things to see if this is where their gifts are and where their skills are. And I think it's really important that we support, that they have the support. We are still creating the curriculum that goes into those post-secondary courses and on Indigenous people. And I think that's another area where the government needs to spend money on education programs, because like in Ontario, they were working on a curriculum when they pulled it. They pulled the programs out of the government of Ontario, pulled the program, from the people who were developing curriculum for the schools. We have the same thing in Nova Scotia. Not every school was teaching about Indigenous peoples in their curriculum. Like I said, Niigaanwewidam was working on curriculum from grades primary to grade 7, and they still were working on, when I left in 2014, they were working on the high school curriculum. And I was specifically working on curriculum to do with the residential school legacy. And so I know that it's not like across the board, and it's not across the provinces. It depends on the school board, I guess, the education departments in each province, what's important, what they deem to be important. But as part of our apology, for the residential school and these truth and reconciliation calls to action, it's up to us and all people across Canada to hold the government accountable, to make sure that these are all implemented. Each one of these calls to action are actually implemented into the society, because this is what the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners, their report, what they wrote, what they heard, what they saw. These are all reflections of what survivors of residential school and their descendants feel needs to be done for true reconciliation to happen in Canada. And I think we'll be missing the mark if we let them off on any one of these 94 calls to action. And we're living today in 2020 with the one of the main parts of the Truth and Reconciliation was one of the calls to action. 13 of the calls to action out of these 94 have to do with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We see now where they have left that main call to action aside, and even more so where we see what's happening to our land and our water and all the other things that sustain us today. We see where this is going, and even where they have adopted in BC, they have adopted the UN Declaration. We still see no action, on implementation and how they're going to implement that into to what we see on the land and on the water. So I think it's really important that these are not just words. These are not just words. I mean, the apology, to me, the apology was just words, but we want to see action, and we have to stand by the survivors, their families, and our communities to see these things through. That each one of these are going to have the weight of action and not just words. And it's up to all Canadians for that reconciliation to happen. Yeah.
Phyllis, what you mentioned earlier that education gives opportunity, and that's exactly what I tell young people. Is I say if you go to high school, or even if you don't finish high school, your ability to choose your profession or the job that you're going to do is severely limited. You'll be doing a service industry job, for example, pumping gas, or you'll be doing work that other people will be declaring to you what you'll be doing. If you go to post-secondary, a college or university, then you can make your own job. And that is what I tell you is the difference. And the problem, of course, is that in the world in which we live, Indigenous ideas, Indigenous epistemologies and ways of life and practices, they're not welcome. And so, making your own job, what you're going to find is that people will want that, but they don't know what it is. So, for example, I have a student that just finished a master's degree on Indigenous video games. He got a job like that. I got a student who's working on Indigenous business practices. She got a job like that because she's consulting with businesses all across the city who have never had experiences with Indigenous economies or what it's like to be an Indigenous person where profit's not your only goal. What I'm trying to tell people is that when you go to post-secondary, you get opportunities to be able to make the job that you want. If you don't go to post-secondary, oftentimes people will declare what job you're doing. Why is post-secondary important for our young people?
I'm quoting your father where he says, education got us into this mess and education will get us out of this mess. And I truly believe that. And in our new book called Orange Shirt Day, we quote Murray Sinclair a lot in there. A lot of what I've learned is what I've learned from him. So I deeply respect him for the work that he's done. And in the education system, when I was on my tour across Canada, I didn't see many Indigenous teachers. And I know that that's a huge gap in the system. And the post-secondary programs, I know in BC, they're getting better. And like Dorene said, the curriculum is being developed. But it is still a colonial system of learning. And everybody needs to find a way to indigenize these programs, whether they be teachers or anything in post-secondary. And the teachers I know need to take it upon themselves, specifically non-Indigenous teachers, to learn and to empathize and to learn about taking what they've learned and applying it in the classroom. For instance, smudging. One school in, I believe it was Alberta, we smudged right in the staff room, and I was concerned, and the principal participated with us. Yet in other schools, the smudging, you have to go outside and it's not allowed. And so there's, depending on the champions in the schools and their level of understanding is what happens. And when I talk to high schools, I tell them that residential school history, it's not just Indigenous history, it's Canadian history. Everybody needs to learn about residential schools and the history of Canadians. And that's another one of Murray Sinclair's quotes. And when I was talking to my cousin again last night in the system, and the Indigenous workers that are there are relied upon a lot, and that needs to stop. And when we were writing the chapter for our Orange Shirt Day book, I was trying to get through to Canadians that reconciliation is everyone needs to learn and to find out what reconciliation means to them. It's not just Indigenous people, it's not just non-Indigenous people, it's both, or everybody. We're all here and nobody's going away. Again, Murray Sinclair. So we need to learn to get along and to learn the history
Well, this has been an incredible dialogue for kicking off our series. It's been an enjoyable one. It's been also an emotional one. It's been certainly, I've learned a lot. And so I want to say a huge miigwech to both you, Dorene and Phyllis, for your generous gift of time and for your commitment to education, also your commitment to our people. You are creating incredible impacts for young people that you maybe have never even met. And so I say huge miigwech to you both from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast of Turtle Island. Huge miigwech to you both. And do you want to just say, is there anything in your language that you say to say see you later? So we would say Niigaanwewidam Manawa for the next time we come together.
And we say numultus, numultus, until I see you again. Yeah.
Okay. Phyllis?
And in Shawamach, it's Matweeksten. We'll see you again.
Okay. Well, I say Niigaanwewidam Manawa, miigwech for your time and for the next time that we come together. This has been NCTR Dialogues, analyzing the TRC calls to action, where we've come, where we're going, and as huge miigwech to you for your gifts. We'll see you again.
All right, thank you.